We're going to roll up our sleeves and get outside the D.C. left versus right groupthink that fails us so utterly on so much of the conventional media. We're going to turn to people who actually look at the facts, even with a perspective that doesn't necessarily make clear black and white good versus evil conclusions. Life is complicated. The world is complicated. Joining me to talk about that in relationship to the latest and the fallout of the Ukraine conflict is Colonel Douglas Macgregor. How are you doing, sir?
Great. Thanks, David. How are you?
Doing well. I wanted to kind of get you on. We've been a few months since we had you on, but a lot of things have happened. I'm just seeing here today that Zelensky is calling on NATO to launch preemptive strikes against Russia to eliminate the possibility of a Russian nuclear strike. The president was speaking about the period before February 24th. Preventative measures should have been used at that time to prevent Russia from unleashing a war. I remind you that only measures discussed at that time were preventative sanctions. There's also, talks that this is a turning point in the war because Russia is losing ground every day. USA Today says Ukraine regains 150 miles of land, an expanding counteroffensive, and Russia blames NATO for the nuclear rhetoric. So give us the lay of the land as you've seen it as this war continues.
Well, first of all, as far as the nuclear issue is concerned, setting aside the very high probability that Mr. Zelensky is mentally unbalanced or worse, he's mentioned these things in the past. He actually talked about preemptive nuclear strikes before the Russians intervened on the 24th of February. It's one of the reasons that Putin felt obligated to make it clear what Russia would do in the event that a nuclear weapon was used against it. Because the Russians have made it abundantly clear that they regard nuclear weapons as purely retaliatory. That is to say, unless someone attacks them with a nuclear weapon, they have no intention of using them, and they don't need them. The second point is this nonsense about Russia is losing, the world is ending, and hundreds of miles are being retaken. It's all nonsense, and it's tragic because it's gotten to the point beyond absurdity. Today, the Ukrainians tried to circulate a video in which they showed allegedly Russian troops surrendering to them. In reality, it was staged. Everyone was Ukrainian, and they simply gave the other side Russian flags and tried to create that illusion. The truth is that Mr. Zelensky's remarks made to an audience in Australia are unambiguous evidence for Ukraine's impending destruction. Ukraine is being bled white. They've had at least 100,000 dead now, perhaps 300,000 wounded at least. These little counterattacks that they have been launching that have gained a few miles here or there have cost them tens of thousands of lives. And the gains are superficial, to be frank, meaningless, and in fact, many of these have already been reversed. But I think the Western news media, along with the governments in the United States and the United Kingdom in particular, are working overtime to try and create this image of a Ukraine fighting back that is simply misleading. And in the meantime, the Russians, who never used more than 20% of their ground force in southern Ukraine, have been running an economy of force mission down south. Essentially, you've got about 50,000 Russian and allied troops. Most of these are not regular army from the Russian military. They are various formations of volunteers, mercenaries, allied units such as the Chechens, and they've done a brilliant job, frankly, of throwing back all these counteroffensives. And all of this is because the Russians are planning on a major offensive once the ground freezes, and they're building up for that. And they're also hoping that with these losses that the Ukrainians may suddenly come around to realizing that they're doomed. But obviously that's not the message that we're getting here in the United States through the mainstream media, nor is it popular in Western Europe. But nevertheless, it's true. And for those of us who bother to dig for the truth. You can find it. It's hard, but it can be done. And the sources I have make it abundantly clear that Russia is by no means in retreat, and it's certainly not losing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at another story, MSN.com, saying Ukrainian army meets little resistance as it approaches city of Kherson. Getting closer to the city, it's the only city under Russian control on the western bank of, and it says the capture was the Kremlin's greatest success at the beginning of the war. And so again, this is what the American media is pushing out there, and it's hard to find out what the actual facts are. So is that what you see as it relates to this city?
Well, first of all, Kherson is a region. The city they're talking about is on the west bank of the Dnieper, and that was a bridgehead that the Russians established months ago, fairly early, with the goal eventually of crossing and probably seizing Odessa. But at the moment, whatever is happening, I would be very suspicious of the reports, because frequently what occurs is that the Ukrainians move into an area, they take some losses, they establish themselves, they run up a flag, and then subsequently are driven out again at great cost. But the rest of the story is never provided. So I'm not sure I'd pay a great deal of attention to it. If you look at the map, which is everybody's focus, those lines change very little. And when they do change, you have to keep in mind that the terrain there is very open and rolling. And terrain in and of itself doesn't have a whole lot of value unless it provides you with some military advantage. And so the Russian and allied forces down there have been instructed by the Russian military leadership that if it makes sense for them to fall back and defend a better position, that they are certainly free to do so and don't need to ask permission to execute the move. It would be analogous to fighting your way back and forth across Kansas, vast stretches of open terrain. The real question is, what do you hold on to that gives you an advantage? And the Russians have done this. Now, the Ukrainians, on the other hand, have been trying desperately ever since the 24th of February to defend every last inch of Ukrainian territory, and then they've committed themselves under Zelensky to try and retake everything that they've lost. It's a losing proposition because it's costing too many lives. And very shortly, I think we will discover that this entire front is going to crack. The Russians have now moved towards a town called Bakhmut, which is really the central logistical hub for the Ukrainian front in the south. If that falls, then the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back to a town called Kramatorsk, which is much further to the north and the west, and the entire line will shift. But again, all of these areas that we're talking about are in flat, open terrain, punctuated by some forests. But there are no major hill masses or mountains, anything like that. So it's misleading to attribute much importance to what the Ukrainians say this day or the next. I think the important thing is that, sadly, the Ukrainians are running out of human beings to throw into Russian gunfire and missile fire. And I think the future is grim for them. And I think that's why Mr. Zelensky is making such a desperate plea for the use of nuclear weapons, because he knows this state called Ukraine is dying. He's presiding over a catastrophe, and he's hoping that he can convince someone somewhere to use a nuclear weapon, which, of course, is sheer lunacy, because, David, you and I know, every American knows, that if we were to do such a thing, that would precipitate a massive nuclear exchange that would result in the destruction of much of our country as well as much of Russia. So it's not going to happen, and his statements are going to fall on deaf ears.
So, when he says, Zelensky says, the condition for any kind of negotiation is that it cannot involve Vladimir Putin as the leader of Russia, where is this coming from? Is this just him freestyling his rhetoric, or is this what the British or American government is telling this guy to say?
I think U.S. and U.K. intelligence agencies and operatives have been largely in control of Mr. Zelensky almost from the beginning. I don't think he cooked that up himself. That's a very interesting way to essentially reject the notion that you can negotiate. because the president of Russia is not going to resign to accommodate Mr. Zelensky. That's absurd, any more than Putin would demand that Mr. Zelensky be removed before he talked to the Ukrainians. You've never heard the Russians say anything ridiculous like that. So I suppose his handlers are telling him what to say and what to do. He looks terrible. He looks worn out and exhausted. I wouldn't place much emphasis on any of it at this stage. I think, sadly, we're just going to have to wait through much of the month of October until the ground freezes in November. And then I think this thing will be brought to a tragic but inevitable end.
Because so the winter is going to really be where this is going to shake out, you're thinking here.
Oh, I think so. I mean, look, the Russians never wanted to conquer Ukraine. There was never any interest in that. In fact, if Mr. Zelensky had been willing to sit down and talk with the Russians in March, they probably could have retained virtually everything that they have today in their state. What Mr. Putin's goal was to remove the threat to his country from eastern Ukraine. We had made a whole series of promises, none of which we kept, to the Russians about what we would or would not do in Eastern Europe. And after the coup of 2014, in which we installed a government that would do our bidding, we decided to transform eastern Ukraine into a launching pad for attacks against Russia. And with enormous quantities of money and equipment, we, with the assistance of the British and some of our other allies, turned this Ukrainian force into the largest army in NATO, over 600,000 men, very well equipped and by NATO standards, very well trained. The Russians, when they moved in very slowly because they didn't want to kill very many civilians. They're very worried about that. They've been very worried about infrastructure. They really wanted to negotiate the removal of the danger to their country. When that became impossible, they went ahead and eliminated it. And that 600,000-man army was largely destroyed, David. It doesn't really exist anymore. And the people they're throwing into battle are, in many cases, people straight off the street, put into uniform, handed a weapon, and sent to the front with very little training or preparation. That's how desperate Ukraine is. And the territory the Russians now occupy is territory where Russians live. These are Russians living in Ukraine who've been treated as third-class citizens for years, who've been told to either become Ukrainians and Ukrainianize or seek a different place to live, where they can't speak their language, go to their churches, behave as normal human beings because they live in Ukraine. These people aren't going to become Ukrainians overnight, and so we had the Minsk Accords, and Putin tried desperately to get the British, the French, the Germans, and us to understand that his citizens, his Russian citizens, should be treated equally before the law, like Ukrainian citizens inside this large, multinational, multi-ethnic state. Zelensky and his friends said no. Either you become as what we are or get out. And that resulted in this tragic intervention. But the Russians have never used more than 20% of their ground force, never had more than 80,000 combat troops, that is, people in armor, infantry, on the ground in Ukraine. And most of that regular force has been withdrawn and replaced by these allied forces. Only the artillery, the Air Force, missile forces, rocket forces, those are still regular army, and they are still being employed to support the allied forces, which number about 50,000. These are the Chechens, the Wagner Group, and other, Russian volunteer formations, and what we would consider to be the equivalent of National Guard. But there was no interest in conquering Ukraine, no interest in running into Kiev or anywhere else and making peace at the point of a gun. But now Mr. Zelensky has been intransigent. His handlers are intransigent because we decided we were going to bleed Russia. We were going to sanction them and destroy their economy. And we were going to kill hundreds of thousands of them and ultimately bend Russia to our will and force them to become subjects of the greater global American-dominated financial system. That hasn't worked. All of the sanctions have backfired. It is now our European allies who are in desperate trouble. We are in desperate trouble, too, only it is not quite as acute as it is in Europe. And on top of that, we haven't succeeded in destroying the Russian military at all. It's held together very, very well. And as I said, right now you have this economy of force operation down in the south, while there's a massive buildup from Minsk all the way back into western Russia of forces that will be launched eventually. As I said, I suppose when the ground freezes, because that's the best time to operate in that kind of terrain.
So, when you see the reports out that this is far from over, this is all, in your opinion, propaganda meant to kind of create a PR campaign to get further support for this drawn-out conflict. What is really the motivation here? Is this just a money-making racket for the military-industrial complex on the American side of this, or do they really think that they can turn Ukraine into the new Afghanistan for the Russians?
Well, as I explained earlier, I told you what it's really about, that there's this attempt to destroy Russia, that we've decided to make it this blood enemy that has to be eliminated because it refuses to march down the path that Europe has. Open borders, denationalization, unconditional support for whatever the EU and the World Economic Forum dictate. Russia's not going to participate in that. Wants nothing to do with it. Neither will China, nor India, nor Brazil, nor most countries outside of Europe and North America. Yes, there is a shell game going on. Enormous quantities of money are being shifted from the Hill to the Defense Department, from the Defense Department to the defense industries, and then find their way back to the Hill in lucrative contributions to various political action committees and candidates. So there's no question but what that is going on. But the thing is that Americans need to go back and rethink and remember what's been told to them in the past. We've had all sorts of ridiculous lies and narratives spun out of Kiev and London and New York City in the media and in the intelligence apparatuses. We had the ghost of Kiev, the non-existent MiG-29 fighter that was flying around eliminating dozens of Russian aircraft. It was all nonsense. It never existed. We've had all sorts of major conquests where areas were conquered, the flag ran up, only to find out a day or two later the organization either never existed or it was destroyed and retreated. This has been going on and on and on. And as I say, the most recent one was this ridiculous video made to create the illusion the Russians were surrendering, which was not the case. They were all Ukrainians, and one side was pretending to be Russian. And then we've had all these claims of atrocities, 90% of which are absolute nonsense. The Bucha example is turning out to have been a Ukrainian operation, and everyone that's looked at it objectively outside the theater has concluded that. This is a very one-sided reporting system that is developed in the West. And Americans were told by Donald Trump over and over and over again, fake news, fake news, fake news. Well, he was right. The fake news continues, and Americans need to back away from it.
So when you see the Nord Stream pipeline being sabotaged and the results of this war, does that weaken Russia's relationship with China in terms of, obviously they have to work with them, but does that kind of lose some of their leverage because being isolated from the Western world, they don't get to have that kind of in-between or negotiating stance? They've got to basically cling to China as a critical ally, right? Doesn't that kind of lose their partnership status there a little bit in terms of their bargaining chips?
No, not at all. Russia has everything the Chinese desperately need. Russia has limitless resources, limitless food, limitless fuel, oil, gas, rare earths, minerals, you name it, and the Russians can provide it. There's an unending market for everything that Russia produces. The truth of the matter is that Europe's isolation from Russia, which we've insisted upon, is destroying Europe, but it hasn't hurt Russia in the least. And strategically, all we've done is given excellent reasons to the Chinese, to Indians, to others. And remember, Americans need to keep in mind that most people on the planet live in Asia, not here. That's where the majority of the world's population is centered. That population is overwhelmingly pro-Russian in its outlook. They see the Russians as essentially fighting a battle that they're part of because they don't want to go the way of Europe and anywhere that the United States and its financial system have become dominant. This is about the end of the dollar, Now the Saudis have said we'll do business with the Russians and business with the Chinese in rubles and yuan. The petrodollar is at risk. The truth is we're in a lot of trouble. And this man, Biden, and his friends have managed to destroy in the space of a couple of years all of the strength and the institution that we've taken for granted for decades. That's the truth, and that's what Americans need to understand.
We've got just a minute left, but I know that President Trump wanted to make you the ambassador for Germany, and it didn't work out. But now that we see what's happening with Germany being shafted by the American government in a lot of ways, what would be the response you would take at this situation if you were in that post?
Well, it's very difficult right now because the woman that was appointed as the ambassador is a radical globalist and neocon who is attacking the Germans left and right for not joining wholeheartedly in the war against Russia, which makes absolutely no sense for the Germans at all. I think at this point the great tragedy is that we are destroying the goodwill and affection of the German people for the United States. And if anything, just as we have driven Russia into the arms of China and vice versa, and India, and essentially set up a very powerful alliance against us in Asia and Eurasia, I think we've probably permanently alienated the German people. We'll be lucky if the Germans will do business with us at all in the future.
So it looks like the Biden administration has presided over a catastrophic foreign policy sea change.
Yes, absolutely. That's what the media is concealing. The media is creating the illusion that something good is happening. This has been disastrous for us and for the West. This has made no sense whatsoever. No one has profited from this in the West. And remember, that pipeline represented 40% of gross national product, that is income, hard cash from the West for Russia. Russia has no interest in stopping that. And the fact that we interrupted it not only is threatening to Russia, but it's doing enormous damage to German scientific industrial power, which we need.
Yeah, I don't understand at all the sense-making behind this administration's absolutely insane, absolutely ridiculous, sabotaging the American people's prosperity in real time at a pace that is breathtaking to watch. Thank you, Colonel Macgregor, for joining us as always.
Okay, David. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.